Benvenute e benvenuti su questa live. Io sono Tiffany di Miss Fiction Books. Con me c'è Fiore Manni, scrittrice e content creator che immagino conosciate davvero tutte. E ovviamente siamo qui per un'occasione molto speciale organizzata da PDA Social Club in collaborazione con Fazi Editore, perché la nostra ospite di oggi, per qualche domanda, è Susanna Clarke. Welcome, Susanna.
Oh, thank you so much for giving me this chance to talk to you. It's lovely.
Oh, it's lovely to have you here. And we have quite a few questions because, after quite some times for the new edition of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, it's here in Italy. And can we say that it's one of the most beautiful things ever?
Fantastic.
It's amazing.
Wow.
And also Piranesi came out in Italy last year. So and it's incredible.
My books are so shiny. It's wonderful.
They are. They are.
Yeah.
Because they shine like what's inside these books. Wow, that was great. So I think that we will get into deep with some question about writing, about the books and about the process, I think. So if you're ready, we can start with the questions.
Allora, prima domanda. Quali sono gli autori che le sono stati maggiormente di ispirazione per la sua formazione da autrice?
I think it depends a lot on the book that you're writing, because both Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell and Piranesi both had authors that I was leaning on heavily, that was sort of in my mind all the time that I was writing. And for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I was definitely thinking of Jane Austen, who's an author that I've loved. I don't know how old I was when I first read her, probably 11 or 12. And she sort of has been with me all my life. And I think I'd realized a few years before I started writing Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I read a book by a British author called Charles Palliser called The Quincunx. And it was a 19th century novel written at the end of the 20th century. And I realized you could write a 19th century novel if you wanted. You didn't have to write a 20th or 21st century book. And I thought that I really wanted to write a 19th century novel. And so I constantly went back to Jane Austen, not just the way she has her characters interact and the sort of talk of the characters in the drawing rooms, but also the way that she used language. I would look up specific words to see how she used them, because English has changed quite a lot in the last 200 years. So she was using language quite different. So definitely I was leaning on her heavily. But I was also looking to writers like Charles Dickens and Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories. But then for magic, the magic was a bit different, I think. For the kind of 19th century background, I followed 19th century authors quite carefully. But the magic, I think, I took what I want from various authors, and then I more tried to create something of my own, I think. So I was leaning very heavily on people like C.S. Lewis and the Narnia stories, which I must have read when I was a quite young child and have reread as an adult. I suppose Tolkien also, but all of them, but they were using magic in a rather different way. And also, I think Ursula Le Guin, the Earthsea trilogy, which is I loved those books so much, and I loved the idea of wizards, and wizards having a kind of body of knowledge that they could draw upon. And I think a lot of that came from Ursula Le Guin, although once you transferred it to the Regency of Jane Austen, it looked quite different. But I also wanted to connect English magic to English landscape. So I wanted it to feel like something which was eventually, if you went far back enough, rooted in the landscape, rooted in the earth of England. And for that, I don't really know. The author that comes to mind is probably the poet Ted Hughes, who was from Yorkshire, just a bit north of where I am now. And he wrote a series of poems called Crow in the 1970s, I think. And when I was a child, I was taken to a literary festival, and I saw him read these poems, and they are quite mythical and quite dark. So I think the crow, which is one black bird, stands a bit behind the Raven King, which is another sort of black bird. Again, I don't know whether if you read the poems, you would think, well, this has got nothing to do with Strange and Odd, but I think that was what I was looking to sort of get this very earthy, rocky roots and trees feel of magic. So I think that was a concoction that I drew on several people. For Piranesi, the author that really stood behind Piranesi is the Argentinian author Jorge Luis Borges, and I was obsessed with his stories when I was probably in my 20s. But the interesting thing was I didn't reread them while I was writing Piranesi. I'd actually begun the story of Piranesi in my 20s. So sometimes in the mid 1980s, I'd started this and written 5 or 7 pages and not been able to get any further. But it was definitely my attempt to write a Borges story. And then when I actually came to write it a few years ago, I didn't look back. I didn't reread any Borges until I'd sent Piranesi off to the publisher. He'd gone off, and I picked up one short story, which I knew was about a labyrinth by Borges, which is called The House of Asterion. And I read it, and it takes about 5 minutes to read. It's very, very, very short, very condensed, very, really dense story. And I was astonished because there were all these echoes of Piranesi. Well, not echoes of Piranesi. Piranesi echoes The House of Asterion. But there were things that I'd completely forgotten in that story, but which I had put a version of in Piranesi, which I thought was really interesting.
Thank you so much for your answer. Seconda domanda. Com'è nata l'idea di Jonathan Strange e Mr. Norrell e quanto è cambiata questa idea durante la stesura del romanzo dal 1992 al 2003?
The idea for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell was something actually quite specific. I can't tell you what period of my life this was. I think probably the late 1980s, something like that. I had got into the habit of writing my dreams, as people do, and as writers do. And one night, as I was falling asleep, I had a sort of vision of a tower in a port and some people dressed in either 18th or 19th century clothes. And I sort of knew that one of them was a magician and that something very bad had happened to him, which was why he was now in whatever this place was, which seemed to me very like Venice. And he had met with this group of people, small group of people, and he was sort of friendly. He was becoming their friend, but there was something very dark behind this man. And the next morning I wrote all this down. But I didn't know, it felt quite fertile, I suppose, quite rich, like something I could develop, but I had no idea how. And so I left it and I left it. And some years later, I was staying with my family at Christmas and we had a jigsaw puzzle to do. And the jigsaw puzzle was, I don't know, 3 or 4 elderly men wearing little 18th century wigs on their heads in a library. And I loved this jigsaw puzzle and I did it. I really enjoyed it. But the figure of the little old man, of the older man in the 18th century wig somehow stayed with me. And I began to think of this history, alternative history of England, in which there had been 2 magicians who had, somewhere around the 19th century, who had had a catastrophic quarrel. And it seemed to me obvious that one of them ought to be the man from the jigsaw in the little wig. And for the other, I decided to bring the figure from my dream, who I'd glimpsed in Venice, whose life had gone somehow horribly wrong. And it was sort of by putting those 2 very contradictory characters together, that was the seed of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So the idea of the quarrel was very fundamental. I think the first things I ever wrote was a conversation with Mr. Norrell, reflecting on the quarrel that he'd had. It's difficult to say how it developed during the writing. I think my sense of writing is always sort of trying to unearth something that already exists rather than create something. You feel the story is there somewhere and you have to find it. Obviously, that doesn't mean to say that everything, you know, sometimes you have write whole wonderful scenes and you have to lop them off and it's very, very painful. But I think for me, the idea is you're sort of working towards something which already exists in an ideal way.
Thank you. Terza e ultima mia domanda. Si sa che gli autori mettono sempre un po' di loro e del loro mondo, delle persone che conoscono, nei propri romanzi. Cosa c'è di lei nei personaggi e nella storia?
I think in both Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell and Piranesi both have characters who are scholars, who love books and who have a rather solitary life. Piranesi is not solitary by choice, but having said that, he's alone in this massive, possibly infinite house. He makes the best of it. And Mr. Norrell, from Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, would always prefer to be in his library by himself than anywhere else. There was a tiny little bit of the television series, the television series that they did of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and they took a line from the book where Mr. Norrell's in a carriage. He's being forced by his assistant to go to a party so that he can show London society what a magician is. And he says, I want to go home and read a book. And I can relate very strongly to that. And I think a lot of readers could as well. So I think there's a lot of that in me. This sort of, I think for a lot of writers, you have to have a kind of taste for being on your own with books and the worlds of books. But I also think in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, Strange is a much more theatrical character. He's much more outgoing. He's much more extrovert. He can entertain a room of people. And I enjoy doing that kind of vicariously, I would say, through him.
Thank you so much.
Allora, la prima domanda è: sia Piranesi che Jonathan Strange e Mr. Norrell sono romanzi incentrati sulla possibilità del soprannaturale e come le persone possono interagirci. Sono storie sulla scoperta degli elementi magici che ci circondano e anche riguardo a ciò che pensiamo di conoscere come il palmo della nostra mano. Quali pensa siano le maggiori connessioni tra queste due storie?
I think, like I said, there's a sort of connection in the scholarliness of the characters. Mr. Norrell, both Mr. Norrell and Piranesi are scholars. And they're both very precise. Apart from that, they're quite different. I mean, Piranesi is a kind and gentle person. He's a very sweet person. You'd want to spend a lot of time in his company. The same is not true of Mr. Norrell at all. But they both have this dedication to scholarship. They're both quite pedantic in a way. And I can kind of relate to that. And both Piranesi and Strange and Norrell touch on quarrels between scholars and academics. For Strange and Norrell, it's a big part of the book, the quarrel and the rivalry. In Piranesi, it's sort of way in the background and you just get hints of it, but it's definitely still there. So as you say, they both touch on the possibility of magic. But in both books, I would say the scholars find a certain sort of magic, one version of magic. But in both cases, there's a deeper magic that the scholars kind of miss. In Strange and Norrell, I guess Norrell knows about this deeper sort of magic, which is to do, I think, with paying close attention to the world, to having a sort of respect for the world, and also about, I suppose what I like about magic is the idea that what we think of as the inanimate world, the world outside, is not entirely inanimate, we could have a connection with it. We can, yes, that we could speak to it and it would speak back. Piranesi believes that he is in communion with the house speaks to him, not in words, but on some deeper level, and he speaks back to it. And that's something that the scholars who are playing around with the occult, they know nothing about that. I think both books touch on the idea of getting something back from the past, memories that have been lost knowledge. And both of them also touch on madness as well. Piranesi has a point where he has to ask himself, am I mad or am I not? And in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, Jonathan Strange flirts with madness, you could say. So I didn't think I would be able to, people have asked me this question before, and at first I thought, oh, there's really very little, but in actual fact, it turns out there's quite a bit.
Quite a bit, you say that. Da Jonathan Strange e Mr. Norrell a Piranesi è trascorso un po' di tempo prima di questa seconda pubblicazione. Che cosa l'ha portata a una storia e che cosa l'ha portata invece verso la seconda? E se nel corso del processo creativo, del processo di scrittura, è cambiato qualcosa di sostanziale tra il primo e il secondo romanzo?
Not really. At least I'm not aware of it. I think it was just a very different, Piranesi was a very different story that required a very different approach. In Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I loved having that narrator's voice, which is very much based on Jane Austen. That sort of humorous, witty, or as witty as I could make it, intelligent, possibly slightly female voice. People asked me what gender the narrator was. It wasn't really something I thought about when I was writing. It was also, I think I was also picking up C.S. Lewis's voice from the Narnia books, because that is it's a slightly bossy voice. It's a slightly, it's the voice of a male academic, but it's very friendly as well. But in between writing Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell and the publication of Piranesi, I had been doing a lot of writing in the first person, speaking to the reader directly. So I think it's not surprising that Piranesi was a book that is written entirely in Piranesi's voice. I tried writing, during the writing of Piranesi, I did try writing certain parts in the third person as a narrator, and it just didn't work. It had to be all, I realized, from Piranesi's point of view, or the book just, the energy just all seeped out of it and went somewhere else.
Okay, thank you. No, I cannot imagine Piranesi in third person. It's
No.
like, it cannot be any other way. This is just personal.
I imagined it and it was very bad.
I guess you've tried.
Yes.
I'm sure you've tried, but I cannot imagine it. Anyway, terza domanda. Susanna Clarke ha il grandissimo onore di essere una delle poche scrittrici ad essere molto amate da chi non legge fantasy o il genere fantasy, pur incorporando tantissimi elementi fantastici nelle storie. Come vede questo aspetto? Come lo vede come un limite o come invece una sfida?
When I'm writing, I don't think about genre at all. I'm quite interested in genre as a reader. It helps you when you're looking for the new books, books you want to read. That's quite helpful, but as a writer, I don't consider it. I remember hearing Kate Bush, the musician, in an interview years and years ago, and they said, you have all these different sorts of music that you put together to make your own music. And she said, as far as I'm concerned, there's just music. And I think I'm like that when I'm writing. I don't really think I want to write this sort of book. I just put in all the things that I like magic and labyrinths and statues and this man living this kind of Robinson Crusoe like life. I just concentrate really on the story. I do think about the reader, but in my mind, that's different from, say, an audience or a market. As far as I'm concerned, the publisher can worry about the audience and the market. I just think about the reader, who is one person, and how are they going to understand this? And have I helped them understand what they need to know at this point? So that's really more the way that I do it. And I worked in book publishing for almost 20 years, I think. And I know that I was very, very bad at anything to do with markets. I would say, here's a wonderful idea for a book. And my bosses would say that no one wants to read that book, forget it. So I know I don't know about markets. So I put all of that really out of my mind, and just concentrate on the things that interest me. And whether or not they'll interest other people, I don't really know. But that is, I think, the strength I have, which is to make a story out of the things that fascinate me. I had rather a wonderful tool almost, or opportunity, with the statues in the house in Piranesi, because every room that Piranesi walks through is lined with statues. So I could just occasionally I just put in a statue that meant something to me. There's a statue of an angel caught on a rose bush. And that is a reference. It's a reference to the first book I ever wrote in my 20s, which I never finished, in which there was an angel caught on a rose bush. So you can just sort of put in little things that are meaningful to you. It's nice. It's lovely.
Very lovely, I guess. And well, I think it's fantastic because I can relate to the fact that while you're writing, you don't think I have to do this and this because, you know, they want to read this. It's impossible. You know, you have to discover something new that maybe you love and people can love back and find interesting. No, I guess
think
it's
so.
golden.
Yeah, I think it's very much about following your passion, which is why I think a lot of the advice that's given to new writers to sort of try and work out about markets, that's really not what you should be thinking about at all, I think.
I agree 100%. Nel suo discorso di accettazione del Women's Prize Award ha dedicato il premio alle persone che, similmente a lei, soffrono di stanchezza e fatica cronica, non solo per cercare di stare meglio, ma anche per continuare a cercare di raggiungere i propri obiettivi e i propri sogni. In quanto una persona che capisce molto bene questo ambito e che vive una malattia silenziosa, invisibile, per me è stato molto importante vedere e riuscire ad ascoltare un discorso come questo e vedere una persona che incoraggiava le altre che fanno parte della community di continuare, insomma, a fare ciò che amiamo, nonostante tutto ciò che vediamo come un limite nella nostra vita di tutti i giorni. E io ho anche un po' rivisto in Piranesi una sorta di metafora tra le milioni che ci sono in questo libro della vita di chi vive con una malattia invisibile. Tramite lo storytelling e tramite queste storie è riuscita a imparare qualcosa in più, è riuscita a scoprire aspetti che prima invece non aveva considerato e che fanno parte di queste esperienze, di questo processo?
My illness is not so much chronic pain as it is chronic exhaustion. I have very, very, very low energy. That is the symptom which has stayed with me all through the years. And I think for a long time it was impossible for me to write. I had what we call in English brain fog. I couldn't think, I couldn't concentrate. I certainly couldn't write a novel, which demands, you know, that you're able to get back in the same space day after day after day. So I think for a long time I couldn't write, but I kept going back and to my computer, and I'd write just little bits here and there when I could. But I had an idea for quite a long while that if I got completely better, I would be able to write again. So in my mind, it was a sort of stark contrast. Either I get better and write again, or I don't get better and everything just stays the same forever. And I was very hypnotized by these two possibilities. And I think what I realized, and by starting to write again, was that there was a third possibility, which was that I got somewhat better, part of the way better, but that my life could move on. I would be able to write sometimes, and it would be possible for me to finish something. And I have a friend who is a retired clinical psychiatrist, and he tells a story of how he worked in a clinic years ago with people who were very ill, I think largely with emotional or psychological problems rather than physical. But they realized, or the boss of the clinic said, we cannot cure all these people, but we can improve everybody's life. We may only be able to cure a few of them, but everybody's life can improve no matter. And I think I eventually realized this, that there was a third narrative, not the narrative of getting better and not the narrative of not getting better, but the narrative of just moving forward. And that's sort of where I am now. And I was a little bit inspired also by my aunt, who the last 10 years of her life, she could not really get up from her bed. If she got up from her bed, her blood pressure dropped and she was in danger of dying. So she had to sort of keep lying down or just a little bit propped up. But so she was in one room, basically, for the most of 10 years. But she amazed her doctors by the amount she did. Every day she would go online, and she was obviously quite an elderly person, but she would make the internet work for her, and she would just learn things, new things all the time. And after she died, I found a little notebook of hers in which she'd written descriptions of the tree outside her window. And she obviously felt this connection with the tree. It sort of, I think, represented all of nature to her. And it was just one tree. And about a week before she died, there'd been a big wind, and some of its leaves had been blown off, and she'd been quite worried about this tree. So I think that fed very much into Piranesi, this idea that physically your life might be quite constrained, but that doesn't mean that that doesn't, you can still live, you can still find connections to the world around you, you can still write, you can still explore. I think Piranesi did his long walks, because he walks for miles and miles through these halls, and I think that was me trying, because I can't walk so much now, but that was me walking through him, which was rather nice.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Really. I guess that our questions are over, so I guess we've been through them all. And Susanna, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. I think this is a very special occasion for us. You are one of our main reference as writer, and thank you for being here. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.
It's been great pleasure for me. Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. I'm just thrilled that Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell and Piranesi are in print in Italy now, because as you can tell from both books, Italy is very, very dear to my heart. So I hope that it finds the two books find lots of readers. That would be wonderful.
Con questa intensa, ricchissima, fruttuosissima conversazione che Tiffany e Fiore hanno tenuto con Susanna Clarke e il suo Jonathan Strange e il signor Norrell, si chiude anche l'annata 2021 di PD e Social Club, e non possiamo che darvi appuntamento all'anno prossimo. Ci rivediamo quindi a metà gennaio, direi, forse un po' prima, con nuovi incontri, nuovi libri, nuovi autori, nuove idee, nuove storie, nuove conversazioni. E intanto buon Natale e soprattutto un felice 2022 a tutti.